Salam, it's Keely, Maryum, welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to share a topic that I think is really important for reverts, and it's the topic of learning how to pray. So I know, at least for myself, I was really intimidated, which honestly it's not as difficult as it seems. So if you're intimidated to learn how to pray, like, it's not as difficult as it seems, especially if you break it down in the way that I'm going to share. So I'm just going to share how I learned to pray, maybe tips that I have, things that I might have done differently, that sort of thing. So I'm just going to kind of jump in and begin with how I learned to pray. So the first step for me was learning how to make wudu. I think this is actually really important because in order to pray, you have to know how to do this. It's a very important step. Oh, and if you don't know what this is basically ritual ablution. In English, that would be the word for it. You have to do this in order to pray. You have to be on this in order to pray. So in order to pray, certain conditions need to be met of this, and I would suggest looking into this from accurate sources. If I find any, I will try to link them down below, but basically you should know the conditions of it and what conditions would nullify your ablution and make it so that your prayer would be invalid. I think that's really important to be aware of before anything. And even if you think you're aware of all these conditions, I think you should also look into it because there might be some that you're unaware of. And it's important to know this ahead of time. So with that said, obviously you should practice this, like practicing the different steps, what should be done first. Now, how I would do this is I would practice maybe once or a couple of times a day just to get into the habit of it. So like if you're in your washroom for whatever reason, you could just practice it if you have a little bit of extra time just before you leave the washroom, or maybe if you're showering at the same time, you might as well take that time to practice it for a few minutes. So you can watch videos on how this is done. You can even read about how this is done. I think it's best to watch videos though, because it'll give you a clear example and you'll actually be able to see it. So then after that, the next step is to actually learn how to pray. And so how I did this, and how I would suggest doing this as well, is learning the actions before you learn any of the words, anything that you're supposed to say, anything like that. Just learn the actions, like the physical actions that you take when you pray. And now this differs slightly from certain prayers, like certain ones, you repeat certain parts a certain amount of times, and then others you repeat things less times. So I would suggest looking into this. I don't want to confuse anyone and talk about this. I'm also not like the proper source, I think, to go to. I think there's better sources that can explain this better, and I will try to leave those in the description as well. So there's a lot of videos online that will show you the actions that are taken. I personally, when I was learning, I did a mixture of things. So I had my husband help me to learn how to pray. So I would just stand behind him and I would just follow the actions. He taught me the actions ahead of time, and then I would follow along the actions when he was praying behind him. And then also when my husband wasn't there, he provided me with videos that would show like the actions that you would take, because I was still very new and I still didn't know. And so yeah, I took a little bit of time to practice these actions without any words whatsoever. And I think if you look at it just from a point of, okay, I'm just going to learn this step rather than I have to learn how to pray in general, I think it makes it a lot easier, and it helps you to kind of change your mindset and not be as intimidated. If you don't have any Muslims around you who know how to pray, I would suggest maybe following along with videos. I think that would be your best bet, and maybe practice that like once a day. Maybe pick one prayer time, learn that one prayer, and then move on to the next one. So a tip that I have is that they have these new prayer mats that kind of guide your prayer. So they'll teach you what steps to take and things like that. So if you are able to have access to them, because I think they can be a little bit pricey. And so this isn't sponsored. I don't know any of the specific brands or anything like that. I've just seen different brands with these products. But yeah, they can be a little bit on the pricier side, so I know not everybody has access to these. But personally, I never had that resource, and I don't think it's really necessary. It's just an extra tool if you need a little bit of extra help. And can afford to do so. But I think learning to pray really doesn't require one of these. It's just a little bit of extra help if you need it. So the next step then is actually putting words to the actions. And this too, you can break it down a little bit as well. So you can break it down into the words for one action. So first off, every prayer you have to read a specific surah of the Quran, which is Al-Fatiha. So I would suggest learning that first. That's what I personally did. what you could do is you could just write down the transliteration if you don't know Arabic letters yet, which I assume a lot of people wouldn't. So just there's a lot of transliterations online that you could find, and I would practice reading that, practice listening to it as well. That could really help. And then from there, you can just slowly memorize it. What I did is I would write it like on my phone. And so I had it in my notes app, and I would try to memorize it every day. Like I would sit down and I would try to memorize bit by bit of this surah. So I would read maybe like the first couple of lines, or like just like I would kind of like break it up into manageable chunks and then try to memorize it. And so then I kind of put my phone to the side and I try to see if I can repeat that part, if I can try to retrieve that from my memory. And if I can do that, I kind of look back at it again, see what I'm missing, try to memorize that again a few more times, repeat that in my head, put it away, and then see if I can memorize that. And then I would do that for the entire surah until I can memorize the entire thing. And then also when I was practicing praying, I would also have my notes on me when I still haven't had this memorized yet. And then I would hold it and I would read it, and parts of it I would have memorized, parts of it I wouldn't. So parts of it I would have to look at and other parts I wouldn't. And so it does make it a lot easier though if you're practicing 5 times a day, if you're practicing all of the prayers. But I know for everybody that's not always possible. It's not easy to start out with. For me, when I started praying 5 times a day, when I started practicing this, it was so much quicker to just memorize sections of it. It just got so quick. And I was actually really amazed like at how quickly I was able to learn that, like once I was practicing 5 times a day. Just group it into sections. So like learn Al-Fatiha first, because that's the surah that you use for every single prayer. And then there's also other surahs that you can incorporate. A lot of people like to pick the shortest ones to start out with because it's easiest to memorize when you're first starting. So you can look into those. Again, maybe you can listen to it and look at the transliterations for those and kind of just start incorporating them when you're able to. Like once you have one part memorized, go on to the next and then add that in. And trust me, I know it looks super daunting, but after a while, you start memorizing things so much quicker. Like once you start memorizing it, once you start practicing praying 5 times a day, it gets so much easier. I just want to let all the reverts out there know that you're not alone in being intimidated by learning how to pray, by thinking that it might be something that's so difficult to learn. It's not that difficult. You can do it. It's definitely doable. It's just sometimes looking at something from the outside, it looks really complex, but it's not. So I'm just gonna leave you with a little bit of advice. Just to kind of summarize what I was saying is basically just take it in chunks. Just think of it as like, I'm just gonna learn this one little chunk, rather than I have to learn every single prayer and I have to learn how to do all of them, and I have to learn, to read in a whole new language. Because when you start thinking of it differently, I think that really does help. And I know it can feel hard to incorporate this into your day 5 times a day, but in reality, it's maybe like 20 to 35 minutes, depending on how long you take. Just something to keep in mind. I will try to link resources in the description that I think are good. And so I hope this could be beneficial for somebody out there who is maybe intimidated or doesn't really know where to start. So thank you all for watching. And if this was helpful, if you thought this was beneficial in any way, please do like and subscribe.